Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, Chair of CMC's Board of Directors and President of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. When I say it's great to see you today, it is really great to see people in this room again. For those folks watching on NBC4i, please know that you can continue watching the Columbus Metropolitan Club each Wednesday at noon for free via a live stream on CMC's YouTube channel. Check our website for details, columbusmetroclub.org. We'll hope you'll continue watching. Let's welcome a new CMC member today, Jared Williams of Telhio. The past several weeks, our community has expressed its shock and pain at the death of George Floyd. Over the next months, CMC forums will address many facets of systemic racism that has already been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis and now have been inflamed by Mr. Floyd's death. We begin next week with a forum that explores racism as a public health crisis. We are pleased to feature two leaders at the forefront of this issue, Franklin County Commissioner Kevin Boyce and Columbus City Council President Shannon Hardin. Joe Ingles of the State House News Bureau will host the conversation. There are seats available for the in-house audience. You can register online. You can learn more about CMC, register for events, join CMC, renew your membership, or make a donation anytime at columbusmetroclub.org. Today we are concluding our special report series. We want to thank our special report partners, NBC4 and NBC4i, WOSU Public Media, PNC, Tom E. Daly Foundation, MORPC, Dispatch Media Group, and OSU Wexner Medical Center. We'd also like to thank those of you who purchased virtual seats for this and other forums. We are very grateful for this special support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of your support. Thank you. President Barack Obama appointed Richard Cordray to be the first director of the newly established Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in 2011. The purpose of the CFPB is to promote fairness and transparency for mortgages, credit cards, and other consumer financial products and services. From the beginning, Cordray and CFPB were challenged. With a career that ranges from law student to holder of numerous state of Ohio offices to presidential appointee to a 5-time Jeopardy champ, and now author of Watchdog, Cordray has stories to tell. Please welcome Richard Cordray. And our host and award-winning journalist at NBC4 and CMC board member, Colleen Marshall. Colleen, we look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Well, quite a bit has happened since the last time you and I spoke, and I do want to start. We've been focusing on the implications and the fallout from COVID-19, and I want to start with the consumer protections that are needed more than ever for families at this time. What do you imagine is going to be the long-term problems for families who may be dealing with unemployment and all of us certainly dealing with a recession? What should we be doing?
Well, and thank you, Colleen, and I will say it's good to be out. It's good to be out in the public. Thank you to CMC for hosting this forum. In terms of the current situation, there are going to be a lot of challenges facing consumers. We saw this 10 years ago with the last financial crisis. I spent years saying to people that was the worst financial crisis of our lifetimes, the worst since the Great Depression, hopefully would be the worst we would ever see in our lifetimes, and yet here we are suddenly in an economic collapse once again. For consumers, this always means distress because it means that unemployment rises, people do not have income coming in. It's not only the unemployed, it's also people who remain employed but they have their hours cut, slashed in some cases, and so they just don't have the income that they were counting on. And that can lead to evictions for rent payers, it can lead to foreclosures for people who have mortgages, and it can lead to tremendous amounts of buildup of debt and unpaid bills. And that's going to be a problem for people for some years to come, it appears, as unemployment's likely to be elevated through at least the end of 2021.
During the last economic crisis, there was certainly a gradual recovery. The recovery was uncertain. We saw banks collapsing. We saw the underpinnings of the financial structure in this country. The mortgage system just took a collapse. This time, this is a pandemic. And there are predictions that if we get a vaccine, the economy will bounce back almost instantly. This time next year, we won't be in this situation. Will a vaccine economically cause that kind of a rebound?
Well, I think a vaccine is needed because if we can't reopen properly, if people have to continue with social distancing and have to be confined to their homes or feel confined to their homes, then we won't get to the level of consumer spending and the overall economic activity we had before. The question is, every recession is different. The one 10 years ago was caused by irresponsible lending in the mortgage and housing industries. The one before that was the dot-com bubble of 2001. This is a different cause, as you said. It's the pandemic and the abrupt shutdown of the economy. The difference here that's profound and hard for people to understand and make sense of is how quickly the economy shut down and how dramatically it shut down. We're going to see that growth plummeted by as much as 25–30% in the second quarter of this year. And the question has been for people, is it going to be a V-shaped recovery where it's going to come back again to where it was before? I think it's unlikely to happen and to happen that quickly, although again, for something to collapse as fast as this one did is not something we're used to. Usually we kind of stumble into a recession with interest rates rising to choke off inflation, and then we stumble back out of it with a recovery. We had a slower recovery this last time. Maybe it'll be faster this time, but my sense is there'll be dislocation for some time to come, and it'll be felt in the small business sector and in unemployment in households.
We're also seeing, not surprisingly, it is being felt more dramatically in minority communities. And not surprisingly so. We've talked, they're doing a forum next week about racism as a public health crisis. The disparity that we see on all levels, education, economic, health, always hits the minority communities more. What's going on with their potential to get even worse when it comes to consumer issues? And haven't we seen this before?
We have seen it before. It's what we saw the last time around. Now, again, the last time around was a housing crisis, and a lot of people, especially middle class and especially communities of color, had their wealth tied up in their home values, and when those home values cratered, they lost a lot of their wealth. There was a tremendous adverse impact on Black and Hispanic communities around this country, and it was not solved during the recovery for many. Many got shut out of the housing market, couldn't get back in, couldn't get loans. It creates issues about equal opportunity and access to credit, which was a law that we enforced at the Consumer Bureau. We saw a fair amount of discrimination in lending around this country. It has not gone away. We had big actions, record-setting actions against Hudson City Bank, Bancorp South, American Express, GE Capital, all for discriminating in lending. And it's something that I think we have to worry about again this time. You also see with unemployment, last in, first out, in terms of people losing their jobs, and it's falling disproportionately again on the African American and Latino households.
When you look at what's going on around the country, the current level of unrest, I hear a lot of people saying, this time feels different. This time, the George Floyd-inspired movement feels different because young people of all skin colors are involved in this movement, and there are multi-generational protesters out there. We've seen it on the streets of Columbus. Does it feel different to you? And how could that have a different outcome when it comes to the economy?
It does feel to me that more people have opened their eyes this time. It's always been there to see. As I said, we were not surprised to have to bring fair lending cases around this country against some of the major financial companies. And you see the same thing in our communities. You see discrimination in auto lending. You see discrimination elsewhere. The question for me, and I think for this country, is whether the feelings that people have this time are going to translate into action and real reform. And frankly, as always, that will depend a great deal on whether people's feelings are substantiated by going to the ballot box and making their preferences heard. And if they are, then I think we'll have real change. If they aren't, then I'm not sure whether we will.
As you look around the country at the financial institutions and how they're reacting, not just to the COVID-19, but to the current level of unrest, you must think back to some of what you dealt with. And I imagine when you were at the Consumer Protection Bureau, you would just shake your head some days. I think, for instance, of the Wells Fargo case.
Yes, that's a good one.
It's like even when you hear about them creating thousands and thousands of fake accounts, you almost can't believe it happened and that all those people knew about it.
Yeah, and by the way, this is the book, Watchdog, has a foreword by Elizabeth Warren, and in it I talk about, among others, the Wells Fargo fake account scandal that you described. And one of the interesting things is the Bureau was often criticized by its detractors for trying to use a new term, abusive, that was in the law to describe certain behaviors at the financial companies, and yet the Wells Fargo scandal so perfectly epitomized abusive. An action that the customer cannot properly defend themselves against or fend off, opening accounts in their name, misusing and manipulating their financial information so that executives could make bonuses and employees could keep their jobs, was a perfect example of abusive behavior. And I talk about that fight in the Watchdog book.
When you first had an inkling of what was going on, were you saying to yourself, this can't be true, they can't be that bad?
You know, I had seen enough, both in Ohio, when we went after a lot of Wall Street abuses, and at the CFPB, to not be entirely surprised. And yet, Wells Fargo had previously had a pretty good reputation. They were a big bank that was not an investment bank, not a Wall Street bank per se, and they put a lot of emphasis, so they said, on looking out for their customers. But they had developed an addiction to the claim that they were able to sell more products to a given customer. 8 is great was one of their CEO's slogans, that he expected every one of his employees to be able to sell 8 different Wells Fargo financial products to a customer, and you start thinking about it, it's pretty hard to figure out what those 8 could possibly be. And they were using that to pump up the stock prices, using it on their earnings calls to show how strong the bank was. And although I don't think that they necessarily sent people out to create fake accounts, I don't believe that that was the word that came down from the top. What did come down from the top was find ways to make the numbers. And we don't care how you do it, and we're not going to monitor it closely. And that was all too real to me because it described other problems that we'd seen at these banks where they put in unrealistic goals, and then to meet them, they didn't care how it was done as long as they could parade that in front of investors.
When you think about that systemic problem, and then you look at individual consumers who probably some of them had their lives ruined by these practices. Is that the worst you saw while you were there, or were there other cases that you thought, this is the worst I've ever seen happen to a consumer?
We saw some blatant and intentional things being done to consumers. There was a case involving a company called Hydra. It was a set of corporations, and they had set themselves up offshore to try to defeat enforcement actions against them. We were able to pin them down, and ultimately their ringleader of the company did go to prison for criminal violations. But they were actually taking information about people that they got on the internet when people went to search for loans, and they were misusing it to put money into their accounts initially and then draw it out as though they were repaying loans, and they were able to make tens of millions of dollars from essentially scamming people on a big scale. So I saw some terrible things, and as I say, racial discrimination in lending is a terrible thing. People don't even know it's happening to them until you can find the patterns and the statistical patterns of lending at a given institution. But the Wells Fargo situation was one where the breach of trust for the average bank customer, what do you do with the bank? You put your money in and you trust that they will handle it carefully. They will handle it securely. They won't do anything with it without you knowing about it first, and you'll be in control. And the fact that Wells Fargo abused that trust so severely to us was a really shocking thing.
When Barack Obama put you in that position, what was his call to you? What was his directive on how he wanted you to protect consumers?
I talk about President Obama periodically throughout the book because he was such an important champion of us. Of course, for me personally, he nominated me to be the head of the Bureau and then appointed me and backed me at every turn, so I obviously feel gratitude there. But he took very seriously the mission of the Bureau. When I talk about in the book, when I came for an interview in the Oval Office with him, not a normal job interview, certainly. I had been recommended by Elizabeth Warren, who originally set up the Bureau and got it started, to become the first director. And he laid out for me, he wasn't so much asking me what I thought, but he was giving me his vision for what we should be doing. And he said that he thought that consumer protection and health care would be his two legacies as president. This is only 2 years into his 8 years as president. He already foresaw that. And he thought that the work that we were doing would matter so much to middle-class families across the country, and that's what he wanted us to focus on, was middle-class families across the country. So I took those bearings from him, and we stayed true to that mission all the time I was there.
Now describe your encounters with Donald Trump.
Well,
That's all I'm going to say. I'll just put it that way.
I've never been in a room with Donald Trump, but you might say I was in a room where it didn't happen at one point. We had a big fight with the Congress and with the administration during the time I stayed over under Donald Trump. The last part of my book is all about how we had to take on the Trump administration in various respects. The Congress had overturned one of our regulations, and they were having a celebration at the White House. Normally, those are public events, and he puts his signature on things and holds it up. This was the only one that they ever did that was non-public. They didn't want the public to know about what they were doing. They had financial executives and Congress people in the room. And he started going around the room and asking them whether maybe I should be fired because I was causing so much trouble. And reporters later learned that that discussion was had in that room. What they didn't know was that I was in Tampa at the time for a field hearing on mortgage issues, and I got a call from the White House, an unscheduled call, asking me to hold for the president. And I held for, it was about a minute and a half maybe, and then the person came back on the line and said, well, something's come up, we'll have to do this later. And what I learned later was that John Kelly had come into the room at that point and understood what the discussion was and had shut it down. So that's how close I came to being fired by President Trump, but I have never actually spoken to the man.
He was going to fire you over the phone. Mick Mulvaney, I remember, moved in, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau became a different entity.
Yes.
How would you describe your feelings about the way consumer protections were changed when it wasn't under your watch?
Well, I thought that Mick Mulvaney was an especially unfortunate choice because he'd been a congressperson who had been a hostile foe of the Consumer Bureau. He had taken a lot of contributions from financial industries that we were looking to rebalance, especially the payday lending industry, and he was pretty much antagonistic to the mission of the Bureau. It's interesting that by the time he left, a year later, he did acknowledge grudgingly that the Consumer Bureau was here to stay and that it's an important part of our government, although he certainly did as much as he could during that year to try to upset it and hold it back from doing its work. The new director, Kathy Kraninger, is not an avowed foe of the Bureau like Mr. Mulvaney. She is someone who has tried to steady the ship, but she hasn't been nearly as aggressive as we were at standing up for consumers and making sure they were protected. And I think that that's unfortunate. I think more could be done. I issued a white paper with two of my former colleagues recently to talk about what more could be done urgently right now during this pandemic and the economic collapse we have seen. And I think that there's much more they could be doing to look out for the middle-class people.
So what are you advocating for? What should our financial institutions be doing? What should we be doing that we're not doing during this pandemic to try to shore up families?
So the first thing is that some of the things the Consumer Bureau and the Congress put in place after the last crisis have helped significantly. The mortgage market is safer and better market than it was. We're unlikely to see the extent of foreclosures we saw the last time, in part because of those reforms. Consumers are in a stronger position than they were going into the last crisis. They had less overhang of debt. And I'd like to think that some of the things we did at the Bureau had helped strengthen consumers' position. But they are going to be challenged by lack of income. They're going to be challenged to make their mortgage and rent payments. Congress has stepped up and provided a lot of stimulus, but it's short-term stimulus. We actually had, incredibly, at a time of very high unemployment, we had average household income went up 10% in April because of the stimulus checks and because of the unemployment bonus payments. But that's going to run out shortly. And what needs to be done is consumers need to be protected. The financial companies that are supposed to deliver mortgage forbearance and other types of relief have to be overseen carefully to make sure they actually do those things. And that calls for more government protection, not less. And interestingly, around the country, and this is another thing I talk about in the book, state officials have stepped in to be active on this front in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, and they have provided more protection than the federal government has during the early stages of this economic crisis, which is likely to last, as I say, for quite some time for the people who are unemployed.
I think one of the surprising things that came out of the last recession, the major one a decade ago, more than a decade ago now, but is that we need protection from our financial institutions. We need protection sometimes from our governmental institutions that might not be as concerned about consumers as they are about the funders of political campaigns. Are you still shocked that sometimes our economic enemy is the very people who should be stable and supportive and there for us?
No, I'm not shocked. A good business understands that their long-term relationship with their customers is how they thrive. And there are many good businesses, including in the financial sector, that understand that philosophy and are careful about it. But some of them became very casual. Some of them were willing to actually extract money from their customers in the short term to make earnings goals on a quarterly basis at the expense of the long term. And there were some dynamics that we needed to change. And some of it we needed to change by being tough with enforcement actions when people had crossed the line. And I think that made some difference. I worry, with the Bureau being more timid now and less aggressive, whether that mentality starts creeping back in for some of the financial institutions. But some of them are fine institutions, and some of them can't be trusted with their own customers. And you need somebody looking over their shoulder to hold them accountable, and that's what the Consumer Bureau was set up to do.
Well, the Consumer Bureau is less aggressive, and we know that in recent weeks the President has dismissed the 4th Inspector General, people who are watchdogs, people
Yes.
who have oversight responsibility. He seems to be able to just remove them from their positions if it looks as if they might have oversight. Are you concerned about that trend?
Well, this goes all the way back to Plato's Republic, and the question was asked, who guards the guardians? You know, who's in charge of the people who are supposedly in charge of setting the nation's direction? We need people looking over other people's shoulder, but ultimately, who looks over everybody's shoulder in the last resort? It is the public, the people at large, who vote in elections. And again, it's at the ballot box that true reform will be delivered here. If people are concerned about dismissing watchdogs so that people can do things and get away with them, then the ultimate place for that to be remedied is at the ballot box this fall.
Well, I do have to ask you about politics. Your last statewide election, of course, you ran for governor, and what we saw in the state of Ohio is, boy, Franklin County is blue, Cuyahoga County is blue, even the Cincinnati area now is blue, and Athens has always been blue. But the rest of the state, more than ever before, is red. It's Trump country when you get outside the urban areas. What does that political divide say to you about trends? And we are seeing now that we were told, oh, Ohio's not going to be in play. Ohio is now Trump country. It's not a purple state anymore. But we're seeing a lot of ads from the White House now because Ohio might be in play. Certainly David Pepper from the Democratic Party is trying to convince everyone that Ohio is in play. What political trends have you been watching?
I've never believed that Ohio is not politically in play. We ran a tough, close election in 2018 that both sides fought very hard to win. And Ohio has been up and down over the years. It was won handily by Reagan, but then won by Clinton. It was won handily by George W. Bush, and then less handily, and then was won by Barack Obama. So the fact that Donald Trump carried it last time, you're seeing polls right now that show Joe Biden very competitive with Donald Trump in the state, in part because Joe Biden has a tremendous appeal to working and middle-class Americans and a tremendous connection, I think, with them. And so I think that Ohio is in play, and that's why you're starting to see ads from the Republican campaign to try to shore it up. And I think you will continue to see activity here and around the country. The Midwest will be the battleground, as it has been for some time, the Midwest and Florida. And I think that you're going to see that play out in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the like.
And we're seeing a shift in suburban voters, aren't we, especially women?
We are. And we saw that in Ohio in 2018 to a significant degree, and I think we will continue to see it. We've seen a realignment of rural voters, and that was something different for me. The state had changed in that regard significantly from 2010 to 2018 and from 2006 in particular, and these things can ebb and flow. But I do think that Ohio is a competitive state. I think there's much at stake. People realize that. What happens when you get a high turnout and people come out on both sides is you get a true test of what the public will is. That's what I think an election should be. I'm worried about people being discouraged from coming out to vote, either because of health concerns or because the machinery doesn't work well. And that's something that we all need to be very concerned about. I think, as we saw in Georgia just the other day, a very poorly run election.
Mike DeWine has been getting praised across the country for the way he handled the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early days, one of the first governors to aggressively move toward a shutdown. As you were watching that unfold, what did you think about the way your former opponent was handling this situation?
Yeah, I didn't have access to the same sources of information that Governor DeWine had, but I thought he handled the health side of this crisis pretty well. And I think he was proactive, and he was trying to be careful about protecting Ohioans, and that's something that I know he takes very seriously. I'm more concerned on the economic side, now that we're going to have longer-term economic distress, whether people will be inclined to think that it's going to bounce back and it's all right on its own, whether we will have a wave of foreclosures and evictions, especially as the courts start up again in earnest, and whether people will be unable to bounce back, especially in some of the rural communities and the smaller businesses in the state. So that's a concern for me. I do give him high marks for his handling of the health crisis.
Just about every statewide office is held now in Ohio by a Republican. Can you ever see yourself back on a statewide ballot?
Sure.
We're getting some applause out there. And what ballot might that be?
I don't know at this point, Colleen, but we'll see.
I'm trying to pin you down on that.
Yes, you are.
You mentioned what we're going to be facing in Ohio financially, economically, as we head forward. What's your advice to people? What should we be doing right now to brace for what's coming next?
It depends on which people you're talking about. If you're a small business, you're trying to hang on through this and get your customers back without being at all sure what those customers are going to look like or what their buying patterns are going to be. If you're a household that's lost income, you are needing to get help in terms of your mortgage or your rent. You're needing to get help from debt collectors who are now besieging you. State officials can be helpful in that regard. I've reached out to Governor DeWine and to Attorney General Yost on those issues. The federal government can be helpful. I've reached out and tried to push the CFPB harder to be more aggressive at responding to these needs. And I think in this book, Watchdog, I'm trying to talk about how government can be effective at addressing the problems of the middle class and recognizing the needs of average households across this country. A lot of people think this system is rigged, and it's only there to serve those at the very top who have the influence and can hire the lobbyists, which the financial industry does in great number. But the government can work for the rest of us, and it should. And we have the chance to install the right people with the right attitude to make sure that happens, both in state government and federal government. And we should be very careful in thinking about that as we go to the ballot box in each of these elections.
I thought it was interesting when I saw that your book was called Watchdog. Is that how you viewed your role at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that you are the watchdog, kind of the guard dog for all of us, for the average families, consumers across the country?
The person who always called the Consumer Bureau that, the consumer watchdog, was President Barack Obama. And we had a little argument about the cover of this book, just what kind of dog we should put on it. Should it be a menacing dog? Shouldn't be too friendly a dog. We ultimately opted for a kind of a very alert-looking German Shepherd guard dog, as you say. I think that's the right answer. So.
Did you consult with Barack Obama about that?
Not about the cover, no.
Are you in touch with him now? And do you talk to him about how he sees the consumer protections going, as well as the rest of the country?
I'm in touch with him only a little bit. I'm in touch more with Vice President Biden's people these days. He's actually, as you know, running a campaign for president. But President Obama made a point to come here and campaign in Ohio in 2018. He cares deeply about this country and the future of it. I know he's working on his own book right now, his memoirs, which is something he takes very seriously, and so he's taking careful time over it. But it'll be very interesting to see how things play out this year. I think for President Obama, he sees Vice President Biden as simpatico with him on these issues involving the middle class, which are really at the heart of his legacy, and I think would lead to a different approach in the government if we had a change of administrations.
I do want to remind everyone that in a few minutes we will be taking questions. We have a live audience with us here today, and they will be lining up to get some questions. Remind you about that in case you've got your questions ready, and we're also going to have some of our online audience. Jane has been getting questions from them. It's time for me to put that reminder out. And now let me go back to some more politics. Joe Biden is running, obviously. He's the presumptive nominee. He's clinched it with a number of delegates that he's got. Some people in your party are saying, well, he was the safe candidate to go up against Donald Trump. Some are saying, no, he's the perfect candidate. Your own party can't seem to reach agreement on whether this was the path to go, because the goal always for Democrats has been to defeat Donald Trump. Do you think Joe Biden was the way to go?
As we now look at it, I think very much yes. I had endorsed Elizabeth Warren earlier on, and of course, throughout 2019, there was a vigorous debate on issues within the primary process, as there should be, and as is very constructive and helpful, especially for a party that is out looking to get back into office. With Vice President Biden having now secured the nomination, I think you've seen everybody pretty comfortable with that. Lots of unity within the party. Certainly Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Barack Obama himself, pretty much everybody across the board has endorsed him. And one of the things that they talk about as they do endorse him is the very genuine decency of this man. And how important they think that's going to be in making a contrast in the election this year. This is a man who's obviously known a lot of tragedy. I talk in the book about an event we had at the White House to deal with student loans. And Vice President Biden talking very personally about his own experience when he applied to college. He was the first in his family to apply to college, and he recalled, and you could tell that he hadn't left any of it behind. He recalled how awkwardly his father felt about those meetings with college admissions officers, wasn't familiar with the situation and the circumstances. And this is Senator Biden is someone who served in office for many years but never left behind his middle-class roots. And I think that that is a perfectly great foundation to work from in this election. Where I think ultimately it's the broad middle of the country that decides these kinds of races.
Elizabeth Warren certainly was for, you've touched on student loans, she was forgiveness of the crushing student debt that so many young people are under today. It's this generation of young people who have six-figure student debt can't afford housing. They're putting off having children because of what they have to pay back for student loans. Are you in agreement with her? Should those loans be forgiven? And what about families who say, wait, we saved up and paid off college. Why should they get a free ride?
So Senator Warren, and I refer to in the book often as Elizabeth, as she always encouraged us to do, and have worked closely with her. She's always someone who's been willing to try to stretch the legislative process to see if we can push the boundaries further than the conventional wisdom. And I think it's been one of her appealing qualities as a public official. And I think she and to some extent Senator Sanders have stretched the process here, where you're starting to get support on both sides of the aisle for measures to reduce the crushing burden, as you put it, of student loans. We talked about the domino effect on the economy. Young people who, with this albatross of student loan debt around their neck, can't form a household, can't buy a house, can't start a new business, can't take a risk because of the situation that weighs them down. And there's going to have to be some sort of forgiveness or adjustment of that. You even saw during this pandemic debt relief on the interest payments during the period of the crisis that was granted by Congress on a bipartisan basis under the CARES Act. So I think that the legislative process is being stretched in the direction of recognizing this is a major problem, major public policy issue for the country, something that we have to think hard about and come up with new solutions.
What's the most important consumer policy you would like to see out of whoever the next administration is, whether we're in another Trump administration or a Biden administration? What would you hope to see as the consumer focus?
I think there were a lot of reforms to the mortgage market and the credit card market that came out of the last crisis. We were involved right in the middle of all of those. I think that student loans have not been sufficiently addressed at this point, and probably is one of the leading consumer issues going forward for a new administration. I think there's more that can be done about debt collection and credit reporting, more that can be done about protecting consumers' financial information and their security against some of these breaches and hacks that we're seeing occur at monstrous levels, such as at Equifax and at other places. So I think that there's unfinished business there, considerable unfinished business, but I do think student loans are probably right at the top of the list of how we're going to try to address that debt overhang.
Well, I know Jane is standing by now with some questions that she took from viewers who were watching online. So, Jane, go ahead.
I do. Thank you. We have a couple. Dr. Bill Lafayette asks, what are the biggest threats to financial reform?
Well, I think the two biggest threats that I see are, number one, the power and the clout and the influence of the big financial companies, which was something we had to push against all the time that I was the head of the Consumer Bureau, and it led to criticism from congressional allies of theirs, and it led to resistance to us. And it's just, if you're going to rebalance power in Washington, you're going to have to take on some tough fights against some worthy, formidable opponents. But I would also say then that the attitude and the will of the people who are in these positions to fight for the mission that is essentially the mission of the middle class in this country and how to restore and rebuild it is important. And if the people don't share that vision, then you're not going to get those reforms, and that's a great threat as well.
And just a second question from online viewers. Don Bush asks, is it time to reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act?
That's a possibility. I know Senator Warren favors that. Again, that would be the separation of commercial banking from investment banking. That had been done and was in place for many years, and then was repealed in the late 20th century. And a lot of people think that that has helped fuel some of the problems of the financial companies. I'm not entirely sure what I think about that. But I know Senator Warren feels very strongly about it, and there are a number of others in the Congress, and that will be one of the live issues and coming fights in a new Congress, I believe.
And as is our tradition, we'll be taking some questions from the audience. We ask that you introduce yourself, ask the question, and don't give an editorial, and they make me say that. So please introduce yourself and tell us what your question is for Mr. Cordray.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Fox with Community Strategy Partners. Mr. Cordray, you touched briefly on how the African American and other minority communities are being impacted more severely by the current economic downturn. And we now find ourselves at a convergence of both an economic downturn and an increased awareness of systemic racism. I'm wondering if you have any specific thoughts about how to address both of these together.
Well, again, the ideals of this country that have always been expressed in our fundamental documents, such as the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, are ideals that we've never really lived up to. We've always aspired to do better. We have tried to move closer to that. It's been, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, a long arc of trajectory toward justice in this country, and there's much more to do. I think what's encouraging here is to see some police officers and protesters kneel down together and recognize that together we have to address these problems. We have to find common ground. We have to recognize that we can't just offer platitudes, but we have to have action and reform. And we haven't had it to a sufficient degree. As I said in a tweet last night, Carl Schurz, who was a senator around the time of the Civil War, said that when you talk about our country right or wrong, what that means is when our country is right, it should be kept right, and when our country is wrong, it should be set right. That's something we need to do right now in both of those issues you're describing.
What do you think needs to happen to protect minority families, consumers who really do have, you know, they face different issues when it comes to trying to get credit, to trying to get a mortgage? What needs to happen to level the playing field?
Well, certainly right now in this pandemic, everybody needs to recognize that the economic distress that is being felt widely, and particularly in communities of color, is completely unexpected and unwarranted. It's not like anybody decided suddenly that I'm going to just stay at home and not work. I'm not willing to work. People were at work and their businesses were shut down and they were closed and they were forced to stay at home. So that is economic distress that was done by government policy, not by choice, and people should not be held accountable for the fact that that's going to damage their credit, that it's going to build up debt for them, and that they're going to be facing distress. So we need to have adjustments made to keep people from getting further hurt on that by having their credit scores decline, by being blocked from access to credit, by being charged more for credit, which are classic violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act if they're done based on race or ethnic background. We need strong enforcement of those laws, and that's a part of it as well. And we need to think very carefully and look very carefully at how these effects are being felt in our communities. When we talk about racial justice in policing, we talk about racial justice in consumer, it's all part and parcel of the same issue, the same problem, which is trying to get past seeing people as categories and seeing people as Americans.
And your question, please?
Yes, Renee Delane, founder of Women Who Dare. Mr. Cordray, two questions for you. One, if you will share with everybody the book that most influenced your life. And the second question is, what was the most challenging part of your book to write about?
I'll take the second question first. The most challenging part of my writing this book was that I wanted to say a lot more than I could put into a book. And of course it had to be edited and reduced. I wanted to tell the story that was a political story in part, starting with the Obama administration and the effort to create the Consumer Bureau, going on into the Trump administration, and at first a lot of resistance to the Bureau and then maybe some grudging acceptance of it. I wanted to tell the story of how a group of people with a vision and a sense of mission, took on some of the biggest, most powerful financial companies in this country and in the world, for that matter, and rebalanced the scales toward fairness for the average consumer. And so that was what I wanted to do, and to show how government can work for the middle class and give people hope that that is true, that it's not just something that we have to resign ourselves is not possible in our society today. It is possible, and this Bureau showed a way to do it. In terms of books that influence me, the Bible is one that long has influenced me and always will, especially the King James Version of the Bible with its beautiful expressions and so much wisdom that it contains. But over the years, books like Aristotle's Politics and things that I read in school that have stayed with me are things that I'm sure have influenced my point of view as well.
I want to go back, if I can. You mentioned that people are going to have their credit scores. It's going to be a disaster for a lot of families through no fault of their own. They're willing to work, they had a job, suddenly they're in this position. What is the government's role in controlling that? Is there a way that the government can say to the consumer bureaus, you can't do this, you have to take into account that we're in a pandemic?
There have been some half measures contained in like the CARES Act and in responses to the crisis. By the way, frankly, part of why that's happened, do you remember the big fight over the CARES Act and how it got delayed and people needed to act more urgently? Well, the delays were because there was a battle over whether the CARES Act was going to only provide relief for corporations or whether it was also going to provide things like mortgage forbearance and some protection of student loan interest payments and protection on credit reporting effects. But those are halfway measures in the CARES Act. Some of them will run out before long, and the damage will then be felt just on a deferred basis. And so I think there's more to be done. Whether we'll get more legislation out of the Congress is up in the air right now. And whether we'll get action from those who can take action, which includes, as I said, both federal and state officials, is part of what we'll see as the months and potentially several years now unfold.
All right, and Jane has another question.
Yes, this is from Melissa Fisher. Do you believe the Electoral College can be overcome in November? And in your opinion, will it ever be changed?
And what was the second part?
Will it ever be changed? Will Electoral College ever be changed?
Yeah, I mean, the Electoral College is in the Constitution. It's very difficult to change anything in our Constitution, which is why the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment are so important, because once you have them in place, it's very difficult to get rid of them, and thank goodness. But as for the Electoral College, there have been years where it has been decisive as opposed to the popular vote, not very often. But it has happened, and usually those are critical elections that become controversial. We've seen it happen a couple times now in recent years. The Electoral College can be overcome with strong turnouts and a decisive vote by the people for one choice over another, certainly. As to whether the Electoral College will be abolished, there have been efforts to do that for over 200 years now. They have not yet borne fruit, and I would be reluctant to guess that they will any time in the near future either.
Before we let you go, tell me what's the one thing you hope people take away from your book. What do you want consumers or readers of your book to know that maybe they didn't know before they picked it up?
Well, I tell a lot of stories about individual consumers in the book. And one of the things that people often don't realize when they think they've been cheated or mistreated in the marketplace, they tend to think that they're the only ones. And there's a sense of embarrassment or sense of shame. Why did I let this happen to myself? When you're being cheated, you can defend yourself as best you can, but if you're being deceived, as we found was often true in our enforcement actions, there's not a lot you can do to defend against misinformation. One of the things that I want people to understand is we're all consumers. Everybody in this room, everybody watching on live stream, everybody everywhere is a consumer. That's part of your life. It's a bigger part of your life than it used to be because consumer finance is so pervasive in our lives now. We all use credit products. We all use financial products. We all, for any kind of major purchase, such as a home or a car or education, tend to have to borrow to accomplish that. And so we're all in the same boat there. And we all deserve the same dignified, fair treatment from the companies that deal with us. And we deserve to have somebody in government looking over their shoulder, holding them accountable, making sure that they have to abide by those rules. And that's what the Consumer Bureau is. And the same general approach should be the case across the entire government, it seems to me. The government should be on the side of the people, on the side of the public, on the side of those who don't have, as Senator Warren often puts it, the army of lobbyists and lawyers in Washington looking out for them. This is one of the agencies that did that, and others could do it as well.
All right, Mr. Cordray, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope you found today's forum thought-provoking and educational. It's such an important topic, and we have one of the experts in the country on the stage today to talk to us. So please remember CMC today when you make your big give donations. We hope you'll tune in next Wednesday at noon online or in person here at the Boathouse as we feature Kevin Boyce and Shannon Harden discussing racism as a public health crisis. We are grateful for our live stream partners for the run of our special report series. NBC4, NBC4i, WOSU Public Media, PNC, Tom Daly Foundation, MORPC, Dispatch Media Group, OSU Wexner Medical Center. They've all been great supporters when we've been doing our live stream, so let's thank them. And a thank you to our speakers, Richard Cordray. He's going to have books over there after the forum. And Colleen Marshall. Colleen, as a special thanks for your efforts and professional work on CMC's behalf these past 2 months. There's no question why you're an award-winning journalist. Thank you. We hope to see you in person soon, but until then, be well and stay safe. Thank you.